My mother's will was simple: use her life savings to breathe life back into the turning page, the bookstore she poured her soul into for 40 years. A week after her funeral, the river swallowed half the town, and I was left holding a will that felt more like a curse, forced to decide what my mom loved more, her books or the people she sold them to. Her name was Eleanor Vance, but to everyone in Northwood, she was just Ellie. She was the town's quiet librarian, its unofficial historian, and the keeper of 1,000 stories, both on and off the page. The turning page wasn't just a business to her, it was a sanctuary. It was where she'd hosted story time for kids who were now grown with kids of their own, where she'd started a book club that had been running for 25 years, and where anyone could come in for a cup of tea and a quiet corner, no purchase necessary. 5 years ago, a combination of dwindling sales and her own failing health forced her to close its doors. The faded blue paint and the whimsical sign of an open book with pages turning into birds became just another ghost on a main street that was slowly losing its pulse. Her biggest regret, she'd told me in the hospital, was letting the story end. "I'm a history teacher. I deal in legacies. I understand the weight of the past and the importance of preserving it." So, when her lawyer read the will, I felt a swell of purpose. I was 35, living a comfortable but uninspired life, teaching American history to teenagers who were more interested in TikTok than Teddy Roosevelt. This felt like a calling. Mom had left me the bookstore building outright, and a savings account with just over $300,000. The will was ironclad, drafted with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. My Aunt Carol, her older sister and the will's executor, sat beside me, nodding with grim satisfaction. "The funds," the lawyer read in a dry monotone, "are to be used exclusively for the complete renovation and reopening of the turning page, in the hope that it will continue to serve the community of Northwood for generations to come." A beautiful sentiment, Aunt Carol had declared, dabbing a dry eye with a tissue. Elena's final chapter. It's our duty to see it written just as she intended. Carol is a woman who lives her life in black and white. Rules are rules, promises are promises, and a last will and testament is as sacred as scripture. She's 70, sharp as a tack, and possesses a spine made of reinforced steel. She loved her sister, but she loved order and obligation more. To her, the will wasn't a wish, it was a command. The first week after the funeral was a blur of casseroles, sympathetic pats on the back, and the hollow quiet of my mother's empty house. I spent my days walking through the dusty old bookstore, running my hands over the empty shelves, trying to feel her presence. I could almost hear the creak of the floorboards under her feet and the soft chime of the bell over the door. I started making lists, sketching out layouts. A new coffee bar here, a cozy reading nook there. I was going to do it right. I was going to build a monument to my mother, brick by brick, book by book. Then the rain started. It wasn't just rain, it was a biblical deluge, a relentless, punishing downpour that went on for 2 straight days. The Northwood River, usually a gentle, meandering thing we barely noticed, began to swell. It turned from a clear, lazy ribbon of water into a churning brown monster. We all watched the news, a knot of dread tightening in our stomachs. Voluntary evacuations were issued for the low-lying parts of town, the older neighborhoods down by the riverbank. The neighborhoods where the houses were smaller, the families were younger, and the roots ran deepest. I lived with my mom on a hill on the other side of town, the same house I grew up in. We were safe. The bookstore, thankfully, was on the highest point of Main Street. But I kept thinking about the Petersons. Mike and Sarah Peterson had been our neighbors for my entire childhood. Mike was a self-employed carpenter, Sarah a nurse's aide. They had two kids, a little girl named Lily and a teenage boy, Josh. Mike had helped my mom put up new shelves in the bookstore a decade ago and refused to take a dime for it. Sarah had checked in on my mom every day during her last few weeks. They were good people. They were the heart of this town. Their house was 50 feet from the river. The night the flood levee broke, the town siren wailed like a banshee. The sound cut through the storm, a harbinger of the devastation to come. I couldn't sleep. I just stood at my window, watching the emergency lights paint strobing colors against the sheets of rain, and prayed. When the sun rose the next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was a bruised, unsettling shade of gray. I drove as close as I could to the river front, but the roads were blocked. I got out and walked, my boots sinking into the mud. The sight was apocalyptic. The river had receded some, but it had left behind a war zone. Houses were torn from their foundations, cars were overturned and filled with muddy water, and a lifetime of people's belongings, photo albums, furniture, children's toys were strewn across the landscape, coated in a thick, foul-smelling silt. I saw Mike Peterson standing on what was left of his front lawn, staring at his house. The first floor was gone. The river had just taken it. He was covered in mud, his face a mask of numb disbelief. He was holding a single, small pink rainboot. Lilies. My stomach churned. The monument I was planning to build suddenly felt foolish, a monument to a past that had just been washed away. The days that followed felt like living in a dream, a slow-motion, mud-caked nightmare. The high school gym became a temporary shelter, a chaotic sea of cots, donated clothes, and the shell-shocked faces of my neighbors. The smell was a mixture of disinfectant, instant coffee, and despair. I saw the Peterson family there. Lily was safe, thank God. She was sitting on a cot clinging to a stuffed animal someone had given her, while Sarah spoke in hushed tones with a Red Cross volunteer. Mike was just staring at the wall, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He'd lost his home, his tools, his entire livelihood, all in one night. And he wasn't alone. Dozens of families were in the same position. They had no flood insurance. Most people in that part of town didn't, because the river had never breached the levee before. They had nothing. I spent my days at the shelter, helping distribute food and blankets, trying to be useful. Every conversation was a fresh stab of guilt. I'd listen to people talk about maxed out credit cards, about not knowing where they were going to live, about the FEMA paperwork that felt like a cruel joke. And then I would go home to my mother's quiet, untouched house with her $300,000 sitting in a bank account, earmarked for custom-built shelving and Italian espresso machines. It felt grotesque. It felt wrong. My mother's voice was a constant presence in my head. I remembered her a few years back, during a bad winter when the boiler at the elementary school broke. She organized a bookathon at the Turning Page and raised enough money to get it replaced in a week. A town is a living thing, Daniel, she'd told me, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron after a bake sale. You can't just take from it. You have to tend to its roots. And the roots are the people. What would she do now? Would she really be ordering hardwood flooring while the people she'd sold books to for 40 years were sleeping on cots in a gymnasium? I couldn't believe it. I wouldn't believe it. Aunt Carol arrived a week after the flood, her sensible sedan looking offensively clean amidst the mud-stained trucks of the recovery crews. She marched into my mother's house with a briefcase and a grim expression. "Daniel, we need to move forward," she said before she'd even taken her coat off. "I've spoken with a contractor, a lovely man, highly recommended. He can start on the demolition for the interior next week. We need to get the ball rolling if we're to have a spring grand reopening." I just stared at her. "A grand reopening? Carol, have you looked outside? Half the town is homeless." "It's a terrible tragedy," she said, her voice clipped, devoid of any real empathy. "A terrible, terrible tragedy. But it doesn't change Elena's last wishes. If anything, the town will need a beautiful new bookstore more than ever. A symbol of hope, of recovery." A symbol? It felt more like a slap in the face. A symbol of hope for who? For the people who can't afford to buy a paperback because they're trying to figure out how to pay for a motel room for the week. My voice was rising, sharper than I intended. "Don't be hysterical," she snapped. "This isn't your money to play with. It's your mother's legacy. It's all laid out, clear as day. This is what she wanted. It's what you are legally and morally obligated to do." We argued for an hour. I tried to explain what I was seeing every day, the sheer scale of the desperation. I told her about the Petersons. She just waved a dismissive hand. "You can't solve everyone's problems, Daniel. You can only honor your mother. We'll set up a donation jar at the bookstore's opening. People can give what they can." A donation jar. The absurdity of it left me speechless. We were sitting on a small fortune, and she was suggesting a donation jar. The next day, I started making some calls. Not to contractors, but to a local community foundation, and then, reluctantly, to a lawyer. I wanted to understand my options. The community foundation was ecstatic. A $300,000 disaster relief fund could change everything. It could provide dozens of families with grants for down payments on new homes, help small business owners like Mike rebuild, and get people back on their feet without the crushing weight of debt. The lawyer, however, was less optimistic. He read a copy of the will and sighed. "It's an incredibly specific bequest, Mr. Vance. The language is unambiguous. Your aunt, as the executor, is legally bound to enforce it. If you were to divert the funds, she could sue you for breach of fiduciary duty. The court would almost certainly side with her. The money would be frozen, tied up in litigation for years, and in the end would likely be awarded to the estate to carry out the original instructions." I felt the walls closing in. It was a perfect trap. My mother's love of legal precision had become my prison. That evening, I got an email from Aunt Carol. It was a formal notice. She had scheduled the contractor to begin work in 2 weeks. He required a $50,000 deposit to secure the materials. She had attached the invoice and instructions for the bank transfer. The email ended with a sentence that was both a warning and a threat. "As executor, it is my duty to inform you that if the initial steps to fulfill the will's explicit terms are not taken within 30 days, I will have no choice but to petition the court to have the funds placed under direct estate control to ensure your mother's wishes are honored." The clock was ticking. She had just put a legal gun to my head. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I felt like a ghost haunting my own town. During the day, I'd be at the shelter, serving meals and playing with the kids, feeling like a complete fraud. I'd see Mike Peterson in the corner, on the phone, trying to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of disaster relief, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He'd give me a small, tired nod, and the guilt would twist in my gut like a knife. Then, at night, I'd go home to a stack of threatening emails from Aunt Carol, each one more demanding than the last, filled with architectural plans for the bookstore and deadlines for payment. I was being pulled apart from two different directions, and I was failing everyone. My breaking point came one rainy afternoon. I was in the shelter's makeshift playroom, trying to get a smile out of 6-year-old Lily Peterson. She was a bright, bubbly kid, but I hadn't seen her smile in weeks. She was quietly drawing in a coloring book with a broken crayon. I sat down next to her. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" I asked. She didn't look up. "A house," she mumbled. She pointed her crayon at the lopsided square she'd drawn. "That's my room. It has a window so I can see the river." A tear rolled down her cheek and splattered onto the page, smudging the waxy color. In that moment, something inside me shattered. This wasn't an abstract ethical problem anymore. This wasn't about legal obligations or honoring a legacy. This was about a little girl who missed her bedroom window. A little girl whose parents were broken with worry, whose entire world had been washed away. And I had the power to help them, a power that was being held hostage by my dead mother's wish for a bookstore. That night, I drove to the turning page. The air inside was cold and musty, thick with the smell of decaying paper and memories. I switched on a single lamp, casting long, dancing shadows across the cavernous room. I looked at the grand, empty space and tried to picture it bustling with people, filled with the aroma of coffee and new books. I tried to feel the joy my mother wanted to create. But all I could see were the ghosts of my neighbors, their faces pressed against the glass, looking in at a party they weren't invited to. This couldn't be her legacy. It just couldn't. Defeated, I went to her old office in the back, a tiny room crammed with boxes of paperwork, old photographs, and personal trinkets. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Absolution, a sign, a loophole. I just started digging. I went through old tax records, supplier invoices, letters from publishers. Nothing. Finally, I found a heavy, ledger-style book tucked away in the bottom drawer of her desk. It wasn't a financial ledger. The first page read the story of the turning page. EV. It was her journal. Not a personal diary, but a journal about the store itself. I sat there for hours under the dim light of the desk lamp and read my mother's story. I read about her excitement on opening day, her struggles in the early years. I read about the customers who became friends, the children she watched grow up. And then I started to get to the later years. Her entries became more infrequent, tinged with a deep sadness. She wrote about the rise of Amazon, the struggle to compete with big box stores. One entry from about 6 years ago stopped me cold. "Mr. Henderson came in today," she wrote. "He was laid off from the mill. He didn't have money for the book his son wanted for his birthday. I just gave it to him. Carol would say I'm a terrible businesswoman. Maybe I am. But what good are books if they can't find their way into the right hands? What good is a shop if it doesn't take care of its people? The books are just the excuse, I think. The real business is community." I kept reading, my heart pounding. I was getting closer to something. The last few entries were from after she had closed the store. They were filled with regret, but also with a fierce, unwavering love for Northwood. And then I found it. The last entry she ever made, dated just a few months before she passed away. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "I've been thinking about the will," she wrote. "About the money. It's so important to me that the store comes back. It should be a place of light for this town. A place where people can gather and feel safe. But a building is just a building. The books are just paper and ink. The real stories are in the people who walk through that door. The store is nothing without the community that gives it a soul. If that soul is hurting, the store has to help. That's the only rule that matters. I read the sentences again and again, the words blurring through my tears. It wasn't a legal codicil. It wouldn't mean a thing to a judge. But it meant everything to me. It was the permission I needed. It was her voice, clear as the bell that used to hang above her door, telling me what to do. The will contained her final instructions, but her journal contained her final truth. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, which one I had to honor. Armed with my mother's journal, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't had since her funeral. The fear and uncertainty were replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. I wasn't going to defy my mother's will, I was going to fulfill it. I called Aunt Carol and asked her to meet me. Not at the house, but at the bookstore. When she arrived, she had her briefcase in hand, ready for battle. "Daniel, I hope you've come to your senses," she said, her tone brisk. "The deposit for the contractor is already 3 days late." "I'm not paying it," I said calmly. I gestured to 2 dusty chairs I'd set up in the middle of the empty store. "Please just sit. Hear me out." She remained standing, rigid and impatient. "I've heard it all. The sob stories, the misplaced guilt. It doesn't change the legal reality." "You're right," I said, which seemed to surprise her. "It doesn't change the legal reality. But it changes them all one." I opened her journal, my hands steady, and I read the final entry aloud. I read her words about the soul of the community, about how a building is just a building, about the only rule that matters. When I finished, the silence in the old store was profound. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something uncertain in my aunt's eyes. But it was quickly extinguished. "Eleanor was always a sentimentalist," she said, her voice softer, but no less firm. "Those are lovely thoughts. They belong in a greeting card, not a cot of law. The will is what matters." "I agree," I said, "and I've found a way to honor it. All of it." I laid out my plan. I told her we weren't just going to give the money away. We were going to create the Turning Page Community Fund. We would use $250,000 of the inheritance to provide immediate, direct relief grants to the families who had lost everything. The grants would be substantial enough for down payments on new places, to replace essential tools for workers like Mike, to give people a real, tangible foundation to rebuild their lives. "And what about the bookstore?" she asked, her arms crossed. "What about your mother's explicit instructions?" "That's the other 50,000, I explained. "We'll use it, along with community volunteers, to renovate this space. Not as a retail store that the town can no longer support, but as the Lena Vance reading room and community hub. We'll use her name. We'll preserve her space. It'll have free Wi-Fi, computers for people to use for job applications and FEMR forms. We'll fill the shelves with donated books. We'll host story time for kids like Lily. It won't be a business, it will be a service. It will be the soul she wrote about." I leaned forward. "Think about it, Carol. What's the better legacy? A beautiful, expensive bookstore that opens in a broken town, a constant reminder of what people can't afford, or a legacy of actual, life-changing help given in her name, with a living, breathing community center at its heart. Which story would Ellie be prouder to have told? I let the question hang in the air between us. She could still fight me. She could still take me to court, freeze the funds, and drag this out for years. She would probably even win. But we both knew what that would look like. She would be the woman who sued her nephew to stop him from helping his devastated community, all to build a bookstore nobody was asking for. She would win the legal battle but lose every last shred of respect in the town she grew up in. She stood there for a long time, her gaze sweeping over the empty room. She looked at the peeling paint, the water stain in the corner, the ghost of the place her sister had loved. Finally, she let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound defeat, or maybe of release. "The fund," she said, the words sounding foreign in her mouth. "It will need a board to oversee the grants properly. No foolish giveaways." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made my knees buckle washed over me. "Of course," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'd want you on it." And that was that. The past few months have been a whirlwind. The Turning Page Community Fund was established, with me, Aunt Carol, and the head of the local town council on the board. The applications came pouring in. The first check we wrote was to the Peterson family. I'll never forget the look on Mike's face when I handed it to him. He just held it, speechless, as Sarah wept beside him. Last week, they put a down payment on a small house on higher ground. Mike is already building new kitchen cabinets. Volunteers have flocked to the old bookstore. Mike is leading the renovations, his skills breathing new life into the old walls. We've had a dozen electricians and plumbers offer their time for free. The shelves are slowly filling up with books donated from all over the county. It's loud and messy and chaotic, and it feels more alive than it ever did when it was silent and empty. Next month, we're officially opening the Elena Vance Reading Room. Lily Peterson has already promised to be the first one to check out a book. I know I broke the letter of my mother's will. I took her specific, final wish and I shattered it. There are days when a sliver of doubt creeps in, when I hear Aunt Carol's voice in my head about duty and obligation. I gambled with my mother's legacy, interpreting her heart instead of her words. So what would you have done? Did I do the right thing? Did I truly honor my mother, or did I just build a monument to my own conscience? Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. We appreciate everyone and can't wait to bring more stories your way.